The phone screaming at 3:47 a.m. wasn't just any call, it was the voice Stephen thought he'd never hear again, trembling with a terror that made his 15 years of military service feel like child's play. Stephen Martinez had been awake for exactly 17 minutes when his phone shattered the silence of his small apartment. Not because he couldn't sleep. Sleep had become a luxury he'd forgotten how to afford since returning from his last deployment 6 months ago. The phantom sounds of helicopter rotors still echoed in his dreams, mixing with the faces of men who'd never made it home, but this call was different. This call made his blood freeze. Stephen. Stephen, are you there? The voice was barely a whisper, but it hit him like artillery fire. Marcus. Marcus Rodriguez, his battle buddy, his brother in arms, the men who'd pulled him from a burning Humvee in Afghanistan and who disappeared from the face of the earth 3 years ago. Marcus. What the hell, where have you been? Stephen's hand shook as he gripped the phone. The digital clock glowed 3:47 a.m. in accusatory red numbers. Everyone thinks you're dead. Your funeral, I was at your funeral, man. Listen to me very carefully. Marcus's voice cracked with exhaustion and something else, fear. I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to trust me one more time. The way you trusted me in Kandahar. Remember Kandahar, Stephen? How could he forget? The explosion that should have killed them both. Marcus dragging him to safety while Stephen's legs refused to work, blood streaming down his face, the taste of sand and copper in his mouth. The medal they'd both received. The bond forged in fire and brotherhood that was supposed to last forever. I remember. Stephen's voice barely escaped his throat. But Marcus, what's going on? Where are you? But that was just the beginning of the most terrifying night of Stephen's life. I found something, Stephen. Something they kill people for. And now they're coming for me. The line crackled with static, or maybe it was Marcus's breathing. I need you to meet me. Tonight. In 1 hour. Stephen's military training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, identify threats, establish objectives. But this wasn't a battlefield in Afghanistan. This was his quiet apartment in suburban Chicago, where the biggest threat was usually the neighbor's barking dog. Who's they, Marcus? What did you find? Not over the phone. They're listening. They're always listening. Paranoia dripped from every word. Remember the place where we made that promise? After Johnson died. Meet me there in 1 hour. Come alone, and Stephen, bring your service weapon. The line went dead. Stephen stared at the silent phone, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Johnson. Private Tommy Johnson, 19 years old, who'd stepped on an IED while they were on patrol. The promise they'd made over his body, that they'd always have each other's backs, no matter what, but Marcus was supposed to be dead. The official report said he'd been killed in a car accident in Denver 2 years after their discharge. Closed casket funeral. Stephen had been a pallbearer, carrying what he thought was his best friend's body. What you're about to discover will shake everything Stephen believed about loyalty, truth, and the price of serving your country. The storage unit was exactly where Stephen remembered it, a grimy facility on the outskirts of the city where they'd stored their gear after discharge. Unit 247. Marcus had kept it as a backup plan, he'd said. A place to keep things that mattered. Stephen arrived 20 minutes early, his Glock 19 tucked in his waistband, his senses hyper-alert to every shadow, every sound. The facility was dead quiet except for the hum of security lights and the distant rumble of late-night traffic. He was checking his watch for the third time when a figure emerged from behind a row of units. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking the familiar silhouette, broad shoulders, that particular way of holding his left arm, shrapnel from Fallujah, the confident stride that had led them through more firefights than Stephen wanted to remember. Marcus looked older. Thinner. His hair was longer, unkempt, and his eyes darted constantly, scanning for threats. But it was him. It was definitely him. Jesus Christ, Marcus. What the hell is going on? Stephen's voice mixed relief with anger. Do you know what you put me through? What you put your family through? Your mother still cries when she talks about you. Marcus's face crumpled for just a moment before the hardness returned. I'm sorry. God, Stephen, I'm so sorry. But I couldn't tell anyone. Not even you. Especially not you. Why? We're brothers, man. We bled together. What could be so bad that you had to fake your own death? Marcus glanced around nervously, then pulled out a small device, some kind of electronic scanner. He swept it around the area, watching a small screen. Clean, he muttered, then looked directly at Stephen. What I'm about to tell you, it's going to change everything you think you know about our service. About why we were really in Afghanistan. But Marcus was about to reveal a secret that would make Stephen question everything he'd ever believed in. 3 years ago, I was approached by someone claiming to be CIA. They said they needed me for a special assignment. Something about my language skills, my knowledge of the region. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. They told me it was classified beyond top secret. That I'd have to disappear for a while, but it was for the good of the country. Stephen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. What kind of assignment? They said there were American contractors selling weapons to the Taliban. That some of our own people were betraying soldiers in the field. They needed someone on the inside who could be trusted. Someone with my background. The phone screaming at 3:47 a.m. wasn't just any call, it was the voice Stephen thought he'd never hear again, trembling with a terror that made his 15 years of military service feel like child's play. Stephen Martinez had been awake for exactly 17 minutes when his phone shattered the silence of his small apartment. Not because he couldn't sleep. Sleep had become a luxury he'd forgotten how to afford since returning from his last deployment 6 months ago. The phantom sounds of helicopter rotors still echoed in his dreams, mixing with the faces of men who'd never made it home, but this call was different. This call made his blood freeze. Stephen. Stephen, are you there? The voice was barely a whisper, but it hit him like artillery fire. Marcus. Marcus Rodriguez, his battle buddy, his brother in arms, the men who'd pulled him from a burning Humvee in Afghanistan and who disappeared from the face of the earth 3 years ago. Marcus. What the hell, where have you been? Stephen's hand shook as he gripped the phone. The digital clock glowed 3:47 a.m. in accusatory red numbers. Everyone thinks you're dead. Your funeral, I was at your funeral, man. Listen to me very carefully. Marcus's voice cracked with exhaustion and something else, fear. I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to trust me one more time. The way you trusted me in Kandahar. Remember Kandahar, Stephen? How could he forget? The explosion that should have killed them both. Marcus dragging him to safety while Stephen's legs refused to work, blood streaming down his face, the taste of sand and copper in his mouth. The medal they'd both received. The bond forged in fire and brotherhood that was supposed to last forever. I remember. Stephen's voice barely escaped his throat. But Marcus, what's going on? Where are you? But that was just the beginning of the most terrifying night of Stephen's life. I found something, Stephen. Something they kill people for. And now they're coming for me. The line crackled with static, or maybe it was Marcus's breathing. I need you to meet me. Tonight. In 1 hour. Stephen's military training kicked in automatically, assess the situation, identify threats, establish objectives. But this wasn't a battlefield in Afghanistan. This was his quiet apartment in suburban Chicago, where the biggest threat was usually the neighbor's barking dog. Who's they, Marcus? What did you find? Not over the phone. There, the weight of decision pressed down on Stephen like the roof of a collapsing building. Take the drive, and he'd be accepting responsibility for exposing a conspiracy that could reach the highest levels of government. Refuse, and he'd be abandoning his brother in arms when he needed him most. What Stephen decided in the next 30 seconds would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. A sound from the far end of the storage facility made both men freeze. The soft scrape of a footstep on concrete. Then another. Marcus's eyes went wide with terror. They found us. He shoved the flash drive into Stephen's hand. Take it. Run. Don't trust anyone official, they're all compromised. Marcus, I'm not leaving you, you have to. Marcus pulled out his own weapon, a pistol Stephen didn't recognize. This is bigger than both of us now. Get that information to someone who can use it. The footsteps were getting closer. Multiple sets now, moving with the purposeful coordination of a trained tactical team. Go. Marcus hissed, pointing toward the back fence. There's a hole in the chain link behind Unit 300. I cut it yesterday as an escape route. Stephen clutched the flash drive, feeling its weight despite its tiny size. What about you? I'll buy you time. Now go. Stephen hesitated for one more second, looking at his battle buddy's face, older, harder, but still the same man who'd saved his life in Afghanistan. Then he ran. Behind him, he heard Marcus shout, "Federal agents! Drop your weapons!" But the answering gunfire told Stephen everything he needed to know about who was really hunting his friend. The night was far from over, and Stephen was about to discover that the hunters had become the hunted. Stephen ran through the darkness like his life depended on it, because it probably did. The hole in the fence was exactly where Marcus had said it would be, and he squeezed through just as the gunfire erupted behind him. Multiple weapons, professional coordination. This wasn't some random street crime. His car was parked 3 blocks away, and every step felt like a mile. The flash drive burned in his pocket like a piece of hot metal. By the time he reached his Honda Civic, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The drive home was a blur of red lights and paranoid glances in the rearview mirror. Every car seemed suspicious. Every shadow might be hiding a sniper. Stephen's military training warred with civilian disbelief. This was Chicago, not Afghanistan. Things like this didn't happen in America, but as he pulled into his apartment complex, Stephen realized that his old life was over. The man who'd gone to sleep 6 hours ago, tired, haunted by memories, but safe, no longer existed. In his place was someone carrying information that people would kill for. His apartment felt different when he walked in. Not physically, nothing had been moved or disturbed. But the air itself seemed charged with danger, as if the walls were listening. Stephen double-locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat on his couch with the flash drive in his palm. Such a small thing. Maybe 2 inches long, barely weighing an ounce. But it contained enough information to topple governments and destroy lives. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "Your friend is no longer a problem. Return what belongs to us and you can continue your quiet life." They already knew where he was. They already knew everything. Stephen's blood turned to ice water. Not only were they monitoring him, but the casual tone of the message suggested Marcus was dead. The man who'd saved his life, who'd trusted him with everything, was gone. He powered down his phone and removed the battery, basic operational security from his military days. But if they could track him by phone, what else could they track? His credit cards? His car's GPS? His apartment lease? Stephen realized he had maybe hours, possibly less, before they decided that negotiation was over and direct action was required. He needed to move, and he needed to move smart. First, he needed to know what was on the drive. His laptop was old but functional, and after checking it for signs of tampering, he plugged in the flash drive. What he found made him nauseous: spreadsheets detailing weapon sales to insurgent groups. Audio recordings of phone calls between American officials and Taliban intermediaries. Bank records showing millions of dollars flowing through offshore accounts. Photos of American weapons being used against American soldiers, but the worst were the casualty reports, American deaths that could have been prevented if someone hadn't sold information about patrol routes and mission plans. Names Stephen recognized. Soldiers he'd served with. Lieutenant Harris was just the beginning. Among those names was one that made Stephen's heart stop beating. There, in a folder labeled "Preventable Casualties," was a file with a name that hit Stephen like a sniper's bullet: PFC Jennifer Martinez, Kia, October 15, 2018. His sister. His baby sister who'd followed him into the army against his wishes. Who'd died in an IED explosion while on convoy duty in Syria. An explosion that, according to these files, had been orchestrated by someone selling information about troop movements to the highest bidder. Jenny's death hadn't been random. It had been profitable. Stephen stared at the screen until his vision blurred with tears and rage. His sister, 22 years old, full of idealism and determination to serve her country, had died so someone could make money. Her death had been a line item in a spreadsheet, a transaction in someone's bloody business ledger. The grief he'd carried for 3 years transformed into something harder and hotter. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore, or about some abstract conspiracy. This was personal. His phone rang. Not his cell phone, that was still disassembled on the coffee table. His landline, which nobody used anymore. Stephen let it ring 4 times before picking up. "Hello, Stephen." The voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of accent he couldn't place. "I believe you have something that belongs to us. I believe you murdered my sister." A pause. "That's unfortunate intelligence you've accessed. It complicates things considerably." Complicates. Stephen's voice was deadly quiet. "My sister is dead because of you people, and you call it complicated. Your sister was collateral damage in a larger operation. Regrettable, but necessary." The voice remained infuriatingly calm. "However, we can prevent further regrettable incidents. Return the drive, Mr. Martinez, and walk away. You have 12 hours. Or what? Or you join your sister and your friend Mr. Rodriguez. The choice is yours." The line went dead, and Stephen realized he had less than 12 hours to expose the conspiracy that had killed his sister. Stephen stared at the silent phone, his mind racing through possibilities. 12 hours wasn't enough time to go through proper channels, even if he could trust them, which the evidence suggested he couldn't. Journalists might not believe him without verification. Politicians could be compromised. Law enforcement agencies might be infiltrated, but there was one person who might listen. One person who'd been asking the right questions for years: Sarah Chen, investigative journalist for the Washington Herald. Stephen had seen her work, deep dives into military contractor fraud, exposés on Pentagon corruption. She'd been building cases like this for years, getting close to the truth but never quite reaching it. Now Stephen could give her everything she needed. He spent the next hour copying the files to multiple drives, uploading encrypted copies to secure cloud servers, and preparing packages for different journalists and politicians. If they killed him, at least the information would survive. But first, he needed to get out of Chicago alive. Stephen packed light, just enough clothes for a few days, his service weapon, ammunition, and $3,000 in cash he kept for emergencies. He left his credit cards, his phone, anything that could be traced. The drive to O'Hare International Airport took 47 minutes. Stephen checked his mirrors constantly, varied his route, and parked in the long-term garage where his car would be just another piece of metal among thousands. He bought a ticket to Washington, D.C. with cash, using an ID that technically belonged to him but under a middle name he'd never used professionally. Not perfect operational security, but it might buy him a few hours. But as he walked through the terminal, Stephen realized he wasn't the only one hunting. He was also being hunted. The man in the gray suit was trying too hard to look casual. He'd been 3 gates behind Stephen for the last 10 minutes, matching his pace, stopping when Stephen stopped, moving when Stephen moved. Professional surveillance, but not quite professional enough. Stephen ducked into a restroom and waited. Sure enough, Gray Suit followed him in 30 seconds later, positioning himself at a urinal with a clear view of the stalls in the mirror. Military experience had taught Stephen that when someone is watching you, sometimes the best strategy is to give them something to watch. He entered a stall, made appropriate sounds, then quietly climbed onto the toilet seat and waited. Gray Suit's patience lasted exactly 3 minutes. When he pushed open the stall door, Stephen was ready. The takedown was quick and quiet. Stephen dropped behind him, applied a sleeper hold he'd learned in combat training, and waited for Gray Suit to go limp. 30 seconds, no permanent damage, and most importantly, no noise to attract airport security. Stephen quickly searched the unconscious man's pockets. ID said David Morrison, private security contractor. A phone with multiple encrypted communication apps. A pistol in a shoulder holster. And most interesting of all, a photo of Stephen that looked like it had been taken from a distance. The photo told Stephen something that chilled him to the bone. The photo had been taken outside his apartment building that morning, before Marcus had even called. Which meant they'd been watching him before Marcus surfaced. Which meant Marcus had been right to be paranoid, but wrong about one thing. They hadn't just found out about him yesterday. They'd known all along. The whole thing might have been a setup from the beginning. Stephen zip-tied the unconscious man's hands and feet with plastic restraints from his keychain. Old military habits die hard, and left him in the handicapped stall. Someone would find him eventually, but it would buy Stephen time. His flight to Washington was boarding. Stephen merged into the crowd of passengers, keeping his head down but his eyes up, scanning for more watchers. The boarding process felt like it took forever, but finally he was in his seat, watching Chicago disappear beneath the clouds. For the first time in hours, Stephen allowed himself to breathe. He had copies of the evidence, he had a destination, and he had a plan. Sarah Chen would know what to do with the information, and she'd have the resources to verify it and get it published. But as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, a flight attendant approached his seat. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Martinez?" Stephen's blood froze. "Yes. The captain asked me to inform you that there's been a change in our flight plan. We'll be making an unscheduled stop in Pittsburgh for mechanical issues." Stephen realized that nowhere was safe, and the conspiracy reached farther than he'd ever imagined. Pittsburgh was not on the flight plan. Stephen knew because he'd memorized every detail before boarding: departure time, arrival time, aircraft type, even the names of the flight crew. Commercial flights didn't make unscheduled stops for mechanical issues. They declared emergencies and landed at the nearest suitable airport, which from their current position would have been Cleveland or Detroit. Someone with serious pull had diverted this flight. Stephen looked around the cabin. Most passengers seemed unaware that anything was wrong, but he spotted at least 2 men who were sitting too straight, scanning too regularly, hands positioned too close to concealed weapons. Professional muscle, trying to blend in with business travelers but failing at the details. The flash drive felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. He'd made copies, yes, but if they captured him alive, they'd have ways of making him reveal where he'd hidden them. Stephen waited until the seatbelt sign turned off, then made his way toward the bathroom. One of the watchers, a man with prematurely gray hair and surgical scars on his hands, stood up to follow him. Instead of entering the bathroom, Stephen continued past it toward the galley area where flight attendants prepared meals. The galley was empty. Most attendants were in the main cabin serving drinks. Stephen opened an overhead compartment and quickly removed the emergency life vest from inside. Every commercial aircraft carried dozens of them, and they all had the same basic design: a bright orange vest with CO2 canisters for inflation and a small emergency whistle. Working quickly, Stephen removed the flash drive from his pocket and sealed it inside a small waterproof pouch he'd brought for exactly this purpose. He then carefully opened the seam of the life vest and inserted the pouch deep inside the foam padding, resealing it with the small tube of fabric glue he always carried. The modified life vest went back into a different overhead compartment, 4 rows behind his seat. Even if they tore apart his possessions, searched his body, and interrogated him for hours, they'd never think to look inside random safety equipment. But Stephen's problems were just beginning. When the plane landed in Pittsburgh, he'd be walking into a trap with no way out. The descent into Pittsburgh was bumpy, and Stephen used the turbulence as cover to move around the cabin one more time. He needed to confirm his suspicions about the other passengers and identify potential exits. What he found was worse than he'd expected. At least 6 men who looked like military contractors, positioned strategically throughout the cabin. 2 women who kept checking their phones despite being at altitude, probably receiving updates from ground teams. And most concerning of all, the flight crew was nervous. Too nervous for a routine mechanical diversion. This wasn't just surveillance. This was a mobile prison. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Pittsburgh International Airport. Due to the mechanical issue, we'll be using a special gate for passenger deplaning. Please remain seated until the crew gives you permission to move about the cabin. A special gate. Which meant they'd be deplaning somewhere away from the main terminal, away from witnesses, away from security cameras and TSA agents and all the things that made airports relatively safe places. Stephen had exactly one advantage left. They thought he was trapped, which meant they'd be focused on containing him rather than watching for him to take action. The emergency exit was 12 rows behind Stephen's seat. Boeing 737s had specific procedures for emergency evacuation: pull the handle, push the door out, deploy the inflatable slide. Stephen had memorized the procedure from the safety card, but he'd never actually done it. Well, there was a first time for everything. Stephen waited until the plane was at about 500 feet, low enough that the cabin pressure wouldn't be a problem, high enough that opening the door would create absolute chaos. He moved fast. Down the aisle, past startled passengers, past the first contractor who tried to stand up to stop him. Stephen's military training kicked in. Everything moved in slow motion. His vision tunneled, his heart rate slowed despite the adrenaline. The emergency exit handle turned exactly as advertised. The door popped outward with a rush of air that sent papers flying and passengers screaming. The inflatable slide deployed automatically, but Stephen wasn't planning to use the slide. What Stephen did next would either save his life or end it in the next 30 seconds. Instead of jumping down the slide, Stephen grabbed the emergency rope from the wall compartment and rappelled down the outside of the aircraft. It wasn't a long drop, maybe 15 feet to the tarmac, but it put him outside the terminal building, away from the waiting teams, with access to the airfield. He landed hard, rolled to absorb the impact, and came up running. Behind him, he could hear chaos erupting from the aircraft, passengers screaming, crew members shouting, the whine of sirens approaching. The Pittsburgh International Airport airfield was massive, with multiple runways, taxiways, and service roads. Stephen's military experience included training at various air bases, so he knew the basic layout. He needed to reach the perimeter fence, get off airport property, and disappear into the city. But first, he needed transportation. Airport service vehicles were everywhere: baggage carts, fuel trucks, maintenance vehicles. Stephen spotted a maintenance pickup truck parked near a hangar, keys still in the ignition. Airport workers tended to be trusting, and security focused on preventing people from getting onto the airfield, not keeping them from leaving. Stephen jumped into the truck and drove toward the nearest exit. In his rearview mirror, he could see emergency vehicles converging on the disabled aircraft, but nobody seemed to be pursuing him yet. The airport perimeter road led to a commercial district full of hotels, restaurants, and rental car agencies. Stephen ditched the stolen truck in a hotel parking lot and walked 2 blocks to an Enterprise rent-a-car. "I need a car," he told the clerk, a young woman who looked bored rather than suspicious. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, but I'll pay cash for a week." Stephen peeled off $100 bills from his emergency fund. Cash worked magic. 20 minutes later, Stephen was driving a nondescript Honda Accord toward downtown Pittsburgh, trying to blend in with evening traffic. His phone was still disassembled back in his Chicago apartment, but he needed to make contact with Sarah Chen. A payphone, if he could find one in 2023, would be safest, but those were practically extinct. Stephen's next decision would determine whether he lived long enough to expose the conspiracy that had killed his sister. Stephen found what he was looking for in an aging gas station on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, a payphone that looked like it had been installed sometime during the Clinton administration but still had a dial tone. Sarah Chen's office number was listed online. Stephen fed quarters into the machine and dialed, praying she worked late. Washington Herald, Chen speaking. Ms. Chen, my name is Stephen Martinez. I'm calling about a story that could expose military contractor fraud at the highest levels. A pause. Mr. Martinez, I get calls like this every day. What makes your story different? Because I have documented proof that American officials have been selling weapons to insurgent groups and providing tactical information that's gotten American soldiers killed. Including my sister. The pause was longer this time. Where are you? I'd rather not say over the phone. Can you meet me? Mr. Martinez, if what you're claiming is true, then you're in serious danger. Are you somewhere safe? Stephen almost laughed. No. Definitely not safe. They've been tracking me since Chicago, diverted my flight, and tried to capture me at the airport. Jesus. Okay, listen carefully. I'm going to give you an address in D.C. It's a safe house used by journalists working on sensitive stories. Can you get there? I think so. Drive carefully, vary your route, pay cash for everything. Don't use your credit cards, don't use your phone, don't contact anyone else. When you get to D.C., call this number from a payphone. She rattled off a different number. Can you remember that? Stephen repeated the number back to her. Good. Mr. Martinez. If you really have what you say you have, this could be the biggest story of the decade. But it could also get us both killed. They already killed my sister and my best friend. I don't have anything left to lose. The drive to Washington would take Stephen through the night, but he wouldn't be making the journey alone. Stephen had been on the road for exactly 47 minutes when he noticed the tail. A black sedan, staying precisely 3 cars behind him, matching his speed changes, following his lane changes. Professional surveillance, but obvious once you knew what to look for. They'd found him faster than expected. Either they'd tracked the rental car somehow, or they'd had people positioned at every major route out of Pittsburgh. Either way, running wasn't an option anymore. Stephen took the next exit, winding through suburban streets toward a shopping center. The sedan followed, maintaining distance but staying locked on. At a red light, Stephen could see 2 figures in the front seat, driver and passenger, both with the rigid posture of military or law enforcement. The shopping center was perfect for what Stephen had in mind. Multiple exits, good sight lines, plenty of civilian traffic to complicate any tactical response. He parked near the food court entrance and walked inside, moving casually but purposefully. The mall was moderately busy for a weeknight, teenagers hanging out, families finishing dinner, elderly couples walking for exercise. Stephen found a table in the food court where he could watch the entrance and waited. Sure enough, the 2 men from the sedan entered within 2 minutes. They tried to look casual, but they moved with the coordinated precision of a tactical team. One took position near the main entrance while the other began a slow circuit of the food court. Stephen stood up and walked toward the restrooms, passing close enough to the circling men to get a good look. Military haircut, concealed weapon bulge under his jacket, small earpiece barely visible. Definitely professional operators, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed Stephen was running scared, trying to escape. They hadn't considered that he might be hunting them. What Stephen did next would turn the hunters into the hunted. The men's room had 2 entrances, one from the food court, one from a service corridor that connected to the loading dock. Stephen had spotted it during his initial reconnaissance, and now it gave him the tactical advantage. He exited through the service corridor, circled around behind the stores, and approached the food court from the opposite direction. Now he could see both operators, one still watching the main entrance, the other positioned near the restrooms waiting for Stephen to emerge. Stephen approached the entrance guard from behind, moving through the crowd of shoppers like a shark through shallow water. The men never saw him coming. The takedown was quick and silent. Stephen applied a sleeper hold while using the man's own body to block the view from his partner. As the men went limp, Stephen relieved him of his weapon, earpiece, and wallet. The ID identified him as Robert Chen, private military contractor with Blackwater International. The earpiece crackled with his partner's voice. Rob, what's your status? I lost visual on the target. Stephen keyed the microphone and pitched his voice lower. Target's in the John. Maintaining overwatch. Copy that. Control wants us to take him alive if possible. They need to know what he's done with the package. So they knew about the flash drive, but they didn't know Stephen had hidden copies. That was useful intelligence. Stephen zip-tied the unconscious operator's hands and feet, then propped him in a maintenance closet where he'd look like he was sleeping to any casual observer. With the man's earpiece, Stephen could monitor their communications. With his weapon, a Glock 23, Stephen had upgraded his firepower. Now for the partner, Stephen re-entered the food court, staying in the crowd, working his way toward the restrooms where the second operator was waiting. This one was more alert, scanning constantly, hand positioned near his concealed weapon. Stephen needed a distraction. The distraction Stephen created would bring mall security, police, and media attention, exactly what the conspiracy couldn't afford. Stephen approached a group of teenagers clustered around a table, all focused on their phones and energy drinks. "Hey," he said quietly to the one who looked oldest, maybe 17. "You see that guy over by the bathrooms? Gray jacket, trying to look casual." The kid looked up. "Yeah. I think he's been taking pictures of your girlfriend." Stephen nodded toward a girl in the group. With one of those hidden camera phones. That got their attention fast. Nothing mobilized teenage boys faster than perceived threats to their social group. "Are you serious?" The apparent leader stood up, suddenly looking much older and more dangerous. "Just watch him for a minute. See how he keeps looking over here." The operator, focused on watching for Stephen, had indeed been glancing in their direction. To paranoid teenagers, it looked exactly like predatory behavior. What happened next was predictable and perfect. 6 angry teenagers approached the operator, voices raised, accusations flying. The men tried to back away, to de-escalate, but that only made him look more guilty. "He's got a gun," someone screamed. The food court erupted in chaos. People ran, screamed, dove under tables. Mall security came running from multiple directions. And in the confusion, Stephen walked calmly out of the building and back to his rental car. Behind him, he could hear sirens approaching. The unconscious operator would be found soon, and his partner would be detained for questioning about the weapon under his jacket. It would take hours to sort out, and by then Stephen would be in Washington. But as he drove toward the interstate, Stephen realized something troubling. They'd found him too quickly, tracked him too easily. Either their resources were far more extensive than he'd imagined, or there was something about the information on that flash drive that made it worth mobilizing a small army to recover. What Stephen was about to discover in Washington would reveal the true scope of the conspiracy, and why they were so desperate to stop him. The safe house was a nondescript townhouse in a residential area of Northwest D.C., the kind of place that looked like it housed junior congressional staffers or graduate students. Stephen had driven through the night, stopping only for gas paid in cash, taking a circuitous route that added 3 hours to the journey but hopefully threw off any remaining surveillance. He called Sarah Chen's contact number from a payphone 2 blocks away. "It's Martinez. I'm here. Blue door, second house from the corner. Ring twice, pause, ring once." The door opened before Stephen finished the sequence. Sarah Chen was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'4", with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of intensity that suggested she survived on coffee and determination. "You look like hell," she said by way of greeting. "Feel worse. Can we talk?" She led him into a living room that had been converted into a war room. Computers, printers, multiple monitors, whiteboards covered with photographs and connecting lines like something from a conspiracy thriller. "I've been working on stories like this for 3 years," Sarah explained, gesturing to the boards. Defense contractor fraud, missing weapons shipments, suspicious casualty patterns. I know something's there, but I've never been able to prove the connections. Stephen pulled out one of his backup flash drives. This might help. Sarah plugged it into an isolated laptop, no internet connection, no network access. As the files loaded, her expression changed from professional skepticism to shocked comprehension to righteous anger. Jesus Christ, she whispered, scrolling through bank records. These are actual transaction records. Weapons sales to known terrorist organizations. Payments to Taliban intermediaries. She looked up at Stephen. How did you get this? Stephen told her about Marcus, about the midnight phone call, about discovering his sister's name in the casualty files. Sarah listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. Your friend Marcus was right to be paranoid, she said when he finished. This evidence could bring down the current administration, half the Pentagon leadership, and maybe a dozen senators. People will kill to keep this quiet. People already have killed. Marcus is dead. My sister is dead. How many others? Sarah turned to one of her whiteboards, covered with photographs of American soldiers. Based on the casualty patterns I've been tracking, maybe hundreds. Possibly thousands. Every time there was a major weapons shipment or intelligence sale, American casualties spiked in the following weeks. But Sarah was about to show Stephen something that would reveal the conspiracy was even more extensive than either of them had imagined. There's something else, Sarah continued, pulling up a different set of files on her computer. I've been tracking unusual patterns in military contracts, and I think your evidence fills in the missing pieces. She showed Stephen a complex flowchart displaying financial connections between defense contractors, shell companies, offshore banks, and foreign intermediaries. Look at this timeline. Every major escalation in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria coincided with new weapons contracts worth billions of dollars. Someone has been deliberately prolonging conflicts to maximize profits. Stephen studied the chart, recognizing some of the names from Marcus's files. This isn't just corruption. This is systematic warfare profiteering. It's worse than that. Sarah highlighted a section of the chart. These contracts weren't just about selling weapons. They were about creating demand for weapons. American forces would be given intelligence that led them into ambushes, which would justify increased military spending and more weapons purchases. The implication hit Stephen like a physical blow. You're saying American soldiers were deliberately sent into danger to create a market for weapons sales? I'm saying the evidence suggests exactly that. Sarah's voice was quiet but deadly serious. And according to your sister's file, she was killed in exactly this kind of situation. Her convoy was diverted from its planned route based on actionable intelligence about IEDs on the main road. The intelligence was false, designed to send them into a trap. Stephen sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what Sarah was revealing. His sister hadn't just been killed for profit, she'd been murdered as part of a business plan. We need to publish this immediately, Stephen said finally. We can't. Not yet. Sarah shook her head. These files are explosive, but they're also incomplete. We need verification, corroborating sources, independent confirmation. If we publish without ironclad proof, they'll discredit us and bury the story. How long? At least a week. Maybe 2. Stephen felt a chill of premonition. We don't have 2 weeks. They've been tracking me since Chicago, they diverted my flight, they had teams waiting in Pittsburgh. Every hour we wait gives them more time to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. As if to emphasize his point, Sarah's phone rang. She checked the caller ID and frowned. It's my editor. He never calls this late. She answered the phone. Hello, Jim. What? When? I see. Yes, I understand. She hung up and turned to Stephen with a pale face. "That was my editor at the Herald. He just got a call from someone claiming to be FBI, warning him that I might be in contact with a domestic terrorist who stole classified information. They said you're armed and dangerous, and that anyone helping you could be charged with treason." Stephen realized that the conspiracy had just moved from the shadows into open warfare. "They're not even trying to be subtle anymore," Stephen said, his military training automatically shifting him into combat mode. "That means they're either desperate or they're about to make a decisive move." Sarah was already moving, shutting down computers and gathering files. "We need to get out of here. If they're contacting news organizations directly, they'll have people here within the hour. Where can we go?" "I have another safe house. Older, more secure. But first we need to get this evidence to multiple sources simultaneously. If they're going public with accusations against you, we need to go public with our evidence." Sarah pulled out a secure satellite phone. "I'm calling contacts at the New York Times, CNN, and the BBC. If we can get the story to break simultaneously on multiple platforms, it'll be harder for them to suppress." While Sarah made her calls, Stephen secured the townhouse, checking windows, monitoring the street, preparing defensive positions in case they were discovered before they could leave. His military experience had included urban warfare training, and this felt uncomfortably similar to preparing for an assault on a hostile position. "Bad news," Sarah said, finishing her last call. "My contact at the Times says they got a similar FBI warning about you an hour ago. CNN won't touch the story without independent verification that could take days. The BBC is interested, but they want to verify sources before publication. What about smaller outlets? Independent journalists? That's our best option." Sarah pulled out a laptop and began typing rapidly. "I know several freelance investigative reporters who specialize in military stories. They don't have the same editorial constraints as major networks." Stephen was watching the street through a gap in the curtains when he saw the black SUVs. 3 of them, approaching from different directions, moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation. "We're blown," he said quietly. "Multiple vehicles, professional deployment. We have maybe 2 minutes before they're in position." Sarah grabbed a go bag that was already packed. She'd been expecting this possibility. "Back exit leads to an alley. My car is parked 3 blocks away. They'll have the alley covered too. This is a full tactical operation." Stephen's mind raced through options. The townhouse was well chosen for its multiple exits and sight lines, but it wasn't designed to withstand a coordinated assault by professional operators. "The basement," Sarah said suddenly. "There's a tunnel that connects to the storm drain system. Cold War relic, the previous owner was a CIA analyst who was paranoid about Soviet assassination teams." But even as they prepared to escape through the underground tunnel, Stephen realized their enemies had anticipated that possibility too. The basement tunnel was exactly as Sarah had described, a narrow concrete passage barely wide enough for one person, leading into the city's storm drain system. They could hear footsteps above as the assault team entered the townhouse, voices calling, "Clear." As they secured each room, Stephen led the way through the tunnel, Sarah behind him with the laptop bag containing their evidence. The passage was maybe 50 yards long, ending at a grate that opened into a larger storm drain. Stephen used his knife to force the rusted hinges, and they emerged into a concrete channel that ran beneath the street. "Which way?" Stephen whispered. "East. About half a mile to another access point." They moved through the storm drain like ghosts, Sarah using a small flashlight to navigate around debris and standing water. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, but it was better than being trapped in the townhouse. They'd covered maybe 200 yards when Stephen heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of multiple footsteps entering the tunnel system behind them. "They knew about the tunnel," he whispered to Sarah. "They've done their homework. There's a junction up ahead. Multiple passages. We can split up, divide their attention." No. Steven's military training kicked in. Never split up when you're outnumbered. We stay together, we move fast, and we find a way to get above ground. They reached the junction, a larger chamber where several drain passages converged. Steven could see manholes covers above, but they were at least 12 feet up and there were no ladders. The sound of pursuit was getting closer. Multiple teams, moving systematically, checking each passage. Sarah pointed to a narrow maintenance shaft leading upward. That connects to a utility room in the basement of an office building. If we can get up there, can you climb it? I'll have to. Steven boosted Sarah up into the shaft, then pulled himself up behind her. It was a tight fit, maybe 18 inches wide, and the climb was nearly vertical for about 15 feet. Sarah moved with surprising agility for someone who spent most of her time behind a desk. They emerged into a utility room filled with pipes and electrical panels. Sarah used her lockpick tools, another skill that surprised Steven, to open the door leading to the building's basement. Where are we? Steven asked. Office building, mostly law firms and consulting companies. Should be empty this time of night. They made their way to the parking garage, where Sarah's car was waiting, a nondescript Honda Civic that looked like it belonged to any of the young professionals who worked in the building. But as they approached the car, Steven noticed something wrong. The driver's side window was slightly fogged, as if someone had been breathing on it from inside. The trap was more sophisticated than either Steven or Sarah had realized. Steven grabbed Sarah's arm, stopping her just before she reached for the car door handle. Someone's been in your car, he whispered. Windows fogged. Either they're still inside, or they left something behind. Sarah stepped back, her journalist's paranoia now fully activated. Tracking device. Bomb. Both possible. Steven circled the vehicle carefully, checking for signs of tampering. The locks hadn't been forced. Whoever had accessed the car had professional tools. We need different transportation. They found it 3 rows over, a delivery van with commercial plates and no security system. Steven had learned basic vehicle bypass techniques during special operations training, and the van's ignition system was older and simpler than modern cars. This is stealing, Sarah pointed out as Steven worked on the ignition wires. This is survival. We'll return it when this is over. The van started on the first try. As they drove out of the parking garage, Steven could see figures moving in the shadows near Sarah's compromised vehicle, at least 2 men, possibly more, waiting in ambush. Where to now? Sarah asked. Somewhere public, well-lit, with security cameras and witnesses. Somewhere they can't operate freely. Steven drove toward downtown DC, looking for the kind of location that would provide maximum protection from a black ops team. What he found was perfect, the 24-hour diner across from Union Station, full of late-night travelers, security guards, and surveillance cameras. They took a corner booth where they could watch the entrance and ordered coffee they didn't want from a waitress who looked like she'd been working the night shift for decades. We can't keep running, Sarah said quietly. They have resources we can't match. Eventually they'll corner us. Then we go on the offensive. Steven pulled out his phone, a burner he'd bought with cash at a convenience store. We release everything, right now, to every media contact you have. Without verification. Without corroboration. They'll destroy our credibility. Our credibility won't matter if we're dead. Steven began typing. We upload the raw files to WikiLeaks, send copies to every major news organization simultaneously, post summaries on social media. Make it impossible for them to suppress. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. If we do this, there's no going back. They'll never stop hunting us. They're already hunting us. At least this way, we take some of them down with us. But as Steven prepared to release the evidence that would expose the conspiracy, he was about to discover that the enemy had one final, devastating card to play. Steven's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Unknown number, but given their situation, that could mean anything. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Stephen Martinez. The voice was calm, cultured, with the slight accent he'd heard before. I believe we've spoken. The man from the first phone call. The one who'd given Stephen 12 hours to return the drive. Your 12 hours are up, Stephen said. Indeed they are. Which is why I'm making you a final offer. The voice remained infuriatingly calm. You and Ms. Chen will cease your activities immediately, destroy all copies of the stolen information, and disappear. In exchange, we'll allow you to live. And if we refuse, then you'll join your sister, your friend Mr. Rodriguez, and unfortunately, Ms. Chen's younger brother David, who is currently enrolled at Georgetown Law School. Sarah went pale. She grabbed Stephen's wrist, her grip tight with fear. You're threatening innocent civilians, Stephen said, but he felt the tactical situation shifting beneath him. Mr. Martinez, we've been at war for 20 years. There are no innocent civilians, only acceptable and unacceptable casualties. Your choice determines which category Ms. Chen's brother falls into. The line went dead. Sarah was already dialing her brother's number, hands shaking. It went straight to voicemail. He's not answering, she whispered. David always answers his phone. Stephen felt the familiar weight of impossible choices. In Afghanistan, he'd faced situations where every option led to casualties, where success meant choosing which lives to sacrifice. He thought those days were behind him. We can't give in to them, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. If we do, they'll just kill us anyway once we're no longer useful. And if we don't, they'll kill your brother to prove they're serious, then come after us anyway. Stephen's military training included contingency planning for hostage situations. The first rule was never to negotiate from a position of weakness. But right now, they had no strength to negotiate from. There's a third option, Stephen said slowly. The third option would require Stephen to use skills he'd hoped never to need again. What kind of third option? Sarah asked. We go after them. Directly. Before they can hurt your brother. Stephen, these aren't random criminals. They're professional operators with government resources. We can't what? Fight back. Stephen's voice carried echoes of the soldier he'd once been. Sarah, I've been running from these people for 2 days, reacting to their moves, letting them control the situation. It's time to take the initiative. Sarah stared at him. You're talking about offensive action. Against people who might be federal agents. These people murdered my sister. They killed Marcus. They're threatening your brother. They're not federal agents, they're war criminals with government connections. Stephen pulled out the materials he'd taken from the unconscious operator in Pittsburgh: ID card, phone, weapon. This gives us a starting point. Robert Chen, Blackwater International. We can trace his contacts, his assignments, his chain of command. And then what? Kidnap someone for interrogation. If necessary. Stephen's voice was flat, professional. Sarah, in Afghanistan I learned that sometimes the only way to stop bad people from hurting innocent people is to hurt them first. Hurt them worse than they're willing to be hurt. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Stephen was suggesting. If we do this, if we cross that line, we become exactly what they've accused us of being. Domestic terrorists. We become people who fight back instead of people who run away. Stephen's phone buzzed with a text message. A photo of a young man tied to a chair in what looked like a warehouse, conscious but clearly restrained. The message read, Ms. Chen has 4 hours to consider our offer. Sarah looked at the photo and something fundamental shifted in her expression. The careful journalist disappeared, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. What do you need me to do? She asked. Together, Stephen and Sarah were about to embark on a mission that would either expose the conspiracy or get them all killed. Stephen spent the next hour planning what he privately thought of as a direct action mission. Not a rescue, they didn't know where David Chen was being held. Not an investigation, they were past the point where gathering evidence would help. This was a targeted operation designed to capture someone with operational knowledge and extract information by any means necessary. The first step was intelligence gathering. Robert Chen's phone had been encrypted, but Stephen's military experience included basic signals intelligence. He couldn't crack the encryption, but he could identify communication patterns, frequency of contacts, and location data. This phone has been in contact with 6 different numbers over the past 48 hours, Stephen explained to Sarah as they worked in the van parked behind a 24-hour Walmart. One of them is probably a handler or controller. The others might be other operators. Sarah had her laptop connected to a mobile internet hotspot, running searches on the information they'd gathered. Blackwater International has contracts with 3 different federal agencies: CIA, DIA, and something called Administrative Solutions, which doesn't show up in any public databases. Administrative Solutions sounds like a euphemism for wet work, assassination, or other activities that need plausible deniability. Stephen checked his watch. We have 3.5 hours before their deadline. We need to move fast. Stephen's plan was straightforward and brutal. They would identify one of Robert Chen's contacts, capture them, and interrogate them until they revealed the location where David was being held. Military field interrogation techniques, applied with civilian rules of engagement, which meant they'd stop short of permanent physical damage, but not much short. The target they selected was Marcus Webb, another Blackwater contractor who'd been in regular contact with Robert Chen. According to social media and public records, Webb lived alone in an apartment complex in Arlington, drove a modified pickup truck, and had a weakness for late-night poker games at a private club. "This is insane," Sarah muttered as they drove toward Arlington. "We're about to kidnap a federal contractor based on phone records and social media posts. We're about to rescue your brother from people who've already committed multiple murders," Stephen corrected. The method is insane, but the logic is sound. The apartment complex where Marcus Webb lived was about to become the scene of the most dangerous operation of Stephen's career. Webb's apartment complex was a typical suburban development, 3 stories, maybe 100 units, residents who minded their own business and parked in numbered spaces. Stephen and Sarah had been watching for 2 hours when Webb's modified pickup truck pulled into space 247. Marcus Webb looked exactly like what he was, a professional soldier turned private contractor. Mid-40s, fit but not bulky, the kind of casual alertness that suggested he was always scanning for threats. He carried himself like someone accustomed to danger but not currently expecting it. Stephen followed him into the building, staying far enough back to avoid suspicion. Webb lived on the 2nd floor, apartment 2C. Stephen gave him 10 minutes to settle in, then knocked on the door. "Mr. Webb. Maintenance. We've had reports of a water leak from your unit." The door opened with the chain still attached. Webb's eye appeared in the gap, scanning Stephen's face and finding nothing immediately threatening. "I didn't report any leak." "No sir, it was reported by the tenant below you. Something about water stains on their ceiling. I just need to check your bathroom fixtures." Standard social engineering, provide a plausible story that requires cooperation to resolve someone else's problem. Webb hesitated for a moment, then unlatched the chain. Stephen waited until the door was fully open before moving. The takedown was quick and professional, a strike to disable Webb's gun arm, a grab to control his balance, and a chokehold that rendered him unconscious in about 15 seconds. Sarah entered behind Stephen, carrying zip ties and duct tape. They had Webb secured and seated in a kitchen chair within 3 minutes of entering the apartment. "When he wakes up, let me do the talking," Stephen said. "I know how operators think." Webb regained consciousness about 5 minutes later. His first instinct was to test his restraints, then to scan the room for weapons or escape routes. Professional assessment followed by professional resignation when he realized his situation was hopeless. "You're Martinez," he said without preamble. "The one who stole the files." "I'm Martinez." "You're Webb." Let's skip the introductions and talk about David Chen. What Webb revealed under interrogation would expose the final layer of the conspiracy, and the real reason they were so desperate to stop Stephen. Webb was professional enough to remain silent for exactly 37 seconds. Stephen counted, waiting for the contractor's training to war with his self-preservation instincts. "I don't know anything about David Chen," Webb finally said. "Wrong answer." Stephen showed him the photo they'd received. "Your phone has been in contact with Robert Chen's phone 12 times in the past 2 days. Robert Chen was part of the team hunting me. Now David Chen is being held hostage to leverage his sister's cooperation. You're going to tell me where he is? Even if I knew, which I don't, why would I tell you? You're going to kill me either way." "No, I'm not." Stephen's voice was calm, matter of fact. "I'm going to hurt you until you tell me what I want to know, then I'm going to secure you here while we rescue David. When this is over, you can explain to your employers why you gave up operational security." Webb's eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward a cell phone sitting on his kitchen counter. "That's your communication device," Stephen realized. "It's how you receive assignments, report status, coordinate with other operators." Sarah was already examining the phone. "It's encrypted, but it's receiving messages. Someone's trying to contact him." Stephen made a decision that went against every instinct from his military training. Instead of continuing the interrogation, he was going to gamble everything on a single deception. "Here's what's going to happen," Stephen told Webb. "You're going to call your handler and tell them you've captured me. You're going to arrange a meeting to hand me over in exchange for David Chen's release." Webb actually laughed. "That's the stupidest plan I've ever heard. They'll kill all of us the moment they confirm you're there." "Maybe. But they want me alive, remember? They need to know what I've done with the evidence, where I've hidden copies, who else knows about it. That gives us a narrow window where they'll keep me breathing long enough to talk. And then we improvise." Sarah looked at Stephen like he'd lost his mind. "This isn't a plan. This is suicide with extra steps. It's the only way to save your brother." Stephen turned back to Webb. "Make the call." The call Webb was about to make would set in motion a final confrontation that would determine whether the conspiracy was exposed or buried forever. Webb stared at Stephen for a long moment, weighing options. Finally, he reached for his phone. "If I do this, they'll know I was compromised. My career is over." "Your career was over the moment you started taking money to get American soldiers killed." Stephen's voice carried the cold finality of absolute moral certainty. "Make the call." Webb dialed a number from memory. The conversation was brief, professional, and entirely in code words that Stephen couldn't decipher. But the body language was clear. Webb was arranging a meeting, specifying terms, confirming details. 1 hour, Webb said after hanging up. "Pier 7 at the Washington Marina. They'll bring the package, I'll bring you." Package meaning David. That's how they refer to hostages, yes. Stephen felt a cold satisfaction. The plan was insane, but it was also the kind of calculated risk that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. Sometimes the most dangerous option was the safest because nobody expected you to choose it. "What about backup?" Sarah asked. "Shouldn't we call someone? FBI, local police, somebody." "The FBI got a call identifying me as a domestic terrorist," Stephen reminded her. "Local police would be outgunned and outmaneuvered. This has to be clean, fast, and decisive." Stephen spent the remaining 40 minutes planning contingencies. Pier 7 was an isolated location with limited approach routes, tactically disadvantageous for a rescue but perfect for containing a situation. The marina had security cameras, which meant evidence of whatever happened would exist. And the waterfront location provided multiple escape routes if everything went wrong. "I'm coming with you," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "No. This is military action now. You're a civilian. David is my brother. And I'm the only one who can verify that the package is actually him and not some random person they grabbed to fool us." Stephen realized she was right. Without Sarah's identification, they couldn't be certain they were rescuing the right person. "Stay back, stay low, and if shooting starts, run toward the water. These people will kill civilians without hesitation." The confrontation at Pier 7 would determine the fate of everyone involved, and expose the final truth about the conspiracy that had killed Stephen's sister. Pier 7 was exactly what Stephen had expected, a concrete platform extending into the Potomac River, poorly lit, with multiple sight lines and minimal cover. Professional operators would have chosen it for exactly those tactical advantages. Stephen and Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, giving them time to assess the environment and identify possible ambush positions. Stephen counted at least 4 locations where snipers could be positioned, 3 possible vehicle approach routes, and 2 boats that could contain additional operators. "Remember," Stephen told Sarah as they waited in their stolen van, "when this starts, everything happens fast. Don't hesitate, don't second guess, just do exactly what I tell you to do." At exactly the specified time, 2 black SUVs approached the marina. Professional coordination, one parked at the entrance to block retreat, the other drove directly to Pier 7. 4 men emerged from the vehicles, moving with military precision. Stephen could see a 5th figure being helped from the 2nd SUV, a young man whose hands appeared to be zip-tied behind his back. David Chen, presumably, though at this distance positive identification was impossible. "That's him," Sarah confirmed, looking through binoculars. "That's David." Stephen checked his weapons, his service Glock and the pistol he'd taken from Robert Chen, then looked at Sarah one final time. "Whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, remember that we're doing this to stop people who've been getting American soldiers killed for profit. Your brother, my sister, Marcus, they all deserve justice." Stephen and Webb walked onto the pier together, Webb's hands zip-tied behind his back to maintain the illusion that he was Stephen's prisoner. It was a dangerous deception, but it was the only way to get close enough to David to attempt a rescue. The leader of the opposition team was a tall man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He stood behind David, one hand on the young man's shoulder, projecting casual confidence. "Mr. Martinez," the man called when Stephen was 50 feet away. "I'm Colonel Morrison, United States Army. You're under arrest for theft of classified information, conspiracy to commit treason, and terrorist activities. I'm Stephen Martinez, Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy. You're under citizen's arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, treason, and war crimes." Stephen's military training took over, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed under pressure. Morrison actually smiled. "You have impressive courage, Mr. Martinez. Misguided, but impressive. Hand over all copies of the stolen information, and we can discuss terms for your surrender." "Counteroffer," Stephen replied. "Release David Chen, surrender yourselves for prosecution, and I'll consider not killing all of you where you stand." The standoff was about to explode into violence that would determine whether justice prevailed or the conspiracy claimed its final victims. The moment of truth arrived with the subtle shifting of weight that Stephen recognized from 100 combat situations. Morrison's hand moved slightly toward his concealed weapon. The other operators adjusted their stances, preparing for action. Stephen had one advantage they didn't expect: he wasn't planning to negotiate or surrender. He was planning to attack. "Now," he whispered into the radio earpiece he'd taken from Webb. Sarah, positioned 200 yards away with a hunting rifle they'd purchased at a sporting goods store, fired her first shot. Not at a person, Stephen had been clear about that, but at the fuel tank of the SUV blocking the marina entrance. The explosion was spectacular and served its intended purpose: confusion, distraction, and the destruction of the opposition's primary escape route. Stephen moved the instant the explosion lit up the night sky. Webb, still zip-tied but now clearly on Stephen's side, threw himself sideways to avoid the gunfight that erupted. Morrison's team were professionals, but they'd been positioned for a prisoner exchange, not a firefight. Stephen had surprise, superior positioning, and the kind of desperate motivation that made soldiers perform impossible feats. The gunfight lasted maybe 90 seconds. When it ended, 3 of Morrison's operators were down, 2 dead, 1 wounded and disarmed. Morrison himself was alive but bleeding from a shoulder wound, his weapon 20 feet away. David Chen was unconscious but breathing, having been knocked down during the initial exchange of gunfire. Stephen stood over Morrison, his pistol aimed at the colonel's head, finger on the trigger. "My sister's name was Jennifer Martinez," Stephen said quietly. "She died because you people sold information about her convoy route to insurgents. Give me one reason why I shouldn't execute you right here." Morrison, bleeding and beaten, still managed to look defiant. "Because I'm a United States Army colonel, and killing me would make you a murderer. You stopped being a soldier the moment you started taking money to get your own people killed." Stephen's finger tightened on the trigger. All the rage, grief, and betrayal of the past 3 days focused into a single moment of absolute moral clarity. But what Stephen did next would define whether he was a soldier seeking justice or a killer seeking revenge. Stephen held Morrison's gaze for 10 long seconds, the weight of absolute power and absolute choice balanced on his trigger finger. In that moment, he could have ended the life of the man responsible for his sister's death, and no court in the world would have questioned it as anything other than justified self-defense. Instead, he lowered his weapon. "I'm not you," Stephen said quietly. "I don't murder people for convenience." He zip-tied Morrison's hands behind his back, then helped Sarah secure David while she checked him for injuries. The young man was bruised and dehydrated but otherwise unharmed. "We need to move," Sarah said. "Police response time in this area is maybe 5 minutes." "No." Stephen pulled out his phone. "We're going to wait for them. This ends tonight, in the open, with witnesses and evidence and due process." Stephen called 911, then the local FBI field office, then the Washington Post newsroom. By the time the first police units arrived, Stephen had uploaded copies of all their evidence to cloud servers, sent files to multiple news organizations, and recorded a complete confession from Morrison, who, faced with multiple murder charges and overwhelming evidence, chose cooperation over loyalty to his co-conspirators. The story broke simultaneously on 6 news networks the next morning. Pentagon conspiracy exposed: American officials sold weapons to enemy forces. Sarah Chen's byline appeared on the front page of newspapers around the world. Within 48 hours, the scandal had reached the highest levels of government. Senators demanded investigations. The Secretary of Defense resigned. The President ordered a comprehensive review of all military contracting procedures. Stephen testified before Congress 3 weeks later, wearing his dress uniform and speaking with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen combat and survived betrayal. His testimony was broadcast live on C-SPAN and watched by millions of Americans who finally understood the true cost of the longest war in their nation's history. Colonel Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without parole. 17 other military and civilian officials were indicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to treason. The Blackwater International Corporation was dissolved and its assets seized. But the real victory came in a quiet moment 3 months later. Stephen stood at Arlington National Cemetery, at the grave of Private First Class Jennifer Martinez. The headstone was simple white marble, engraved with her name, dates of birth and death, and the words, "Beloved sister, devoted soldier." Sarah stood beside him, along with David, who'd recovered fully from his ordeal. Behind them were dozens of other families, relatives of soldiers who died in the attacks orchestrated by Morrison's conspiracy. "She would be proud of you," Sarah said quietly. Stephen placed a small American flag at the base of the headstone, next to flowers left by other family members. "She would have done the same thing. Jenny never backed down from a fight, especially when it was the right thing to do." A light rain began to fall, and the small crowd of mourners gradually dispersed. Stephen remained at his sister's grave for another hour, telling her about the investigation, the trials, the congressional hearings that had resulted in new oversight of military contractors. "Justice isn't the same as bringing you back," he said aloud. "But it's something. And maybe it'll prevent someone else's sister from dying for someone else's profit." As Stephen finally turned to leave, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: peace. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of purpose fulfilled. His sister's death hadn't been in vain if it led to saving other lives. The conspiracy that had killed Jennifer Martinez, Marcus Rodriguez, and hundreds of other American soldiers had been exposed and destroyed. The guilty had been punished. The system had been reformed. It wasn't perfect justice, nothing could bring back the dead or heal all the wounds. But it was enough. Stephen walked away from Arlington National Cemetery with the quiet satisfaction of a soldier who'd completed his mission and kept faith with his fallen comrades. The midnight call had changed everything. But in the end, it had changed it for the better. And sometimes, in a world full of darkness, that's the only victory that matters.